I'm Naomi Woodspring, and I am here doing an interview with Professor Meredith Minkler. It's my honor to interview you, Meredith. I'd like to just let everyone know about your career before I go ahead with the interview. So I'll put my glasses on here so I can see. And Professor Emerita Meredith Minkler is a professor in the Graduate Group, University of California, Berkeley, and Professor Emerita at the School of Public Health, UCB Fulbright Specialist on Community Engaged in Research, Community Engaged Research in South Africa, the Director of the Health and Social Behavioral FHUCB Founding Director, UC Berkeley Center on Aging. In the 1980s and 90s, Meredith worked with Carol Estes, Chris Phillipson, and others in helping to develop and refine a critical gerontological framework that resulted in several books which have informed much of her subsequent scholarship. Professor Minkler led the first major study of the impacts on older women of full-time caregiving for their grandchildren during the epidemic of cocaine and race-based mass incarceration. Like much of Meredith's work, this research has resulted in true on-the-ground changes. She has led studies with marginalized communities and used her findings for community and policy change. She continues to work with low-income older adults to assess and address food insecurity, and then drive and implement municipal policies to address this problem. She's published 8 books and more than 250 refereed journal articles over her career. And finally, Meredith continues to profoundly flunk retirement. Welcome, Meredith, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Naomi, for that very generous introduction. And thank you also, Haley, for probably getting up at an ungodly hour to tape us, and also the conference planners for enabling us to still be part of a conversation among BSG friends and colleagues, particularly during this unprecedented time. I'd, of course, really look forward to seeing you all in person, and I confess to putting another 10,000 miles between myself and Donald Trump, but it's great to still connect virtually.
Okay, thank you. So, you ready, Meredith?
Sure.
Okay. Over the time that we've been preparing for this conference, it's clear to me that for you, the perspective that the personal is political is not just lip service. These times underline that. And as an elder yourself, how have you been affected by the pandemic?
Well, I'm a first baby boomer and, of course, an American. So for me, the experience of the pandemic, as heartbreaking as it is, has been compounded by the greatest national upheaval over racial injustice since the killing of Martin Luther King 52 years ago. And at 73, both my husband and I have underlying conditions, and we live with a son with serious mental health problems and little appreciation of social distancing. So things that normally would be a big part of my life as a political being, like joining the peaceful protests for Black Lives Matter, seem not a safe option. I'm limited temporarily to being what they call a point-and-click activist, where you're on the computer signing petitions, sending money, writing to Congress, and attending Zoom meetings to fight budget cuts and programs for the elderly. And while that's all important, it does seem limiting and far less satisfying than my life as an elder before the pandemic.
Yes. Well, the current media narrative has been a drumbeat. There has been a drumbeat during the pandemic, this drumbeat about elders. In what ways do you view how this particular social discourse about elders in this pandemic, how do you view it for older people at this time?
Well, I'm glad you asked this, Naomi, because although the media have played a key role in getting out critical information, including the CDC's message not to drink bleach or to take a dangerous drug touted by our president, from the perspective of older people, putting Trump aside, the media have also played a really pernicious role, I think, particularly in the way they're reporting COVID deaths. When a younger person dies of the virus, for example, she is typically described in the media as a 43-year-old teacher, mother of three, active in her church or community association, a lover of poetry, etc. But that same woman, if she's an elder, and unless she's rich, famous, or both, is described typically as a 70-year-old woman with underlying health conditions. Now, never mind that this woman was also a mother, perhaps a grandmother, a wife and life partner, a retired teacher, a gifted artist. Her COVID biography, as written by the media, erases everything but her age and the fact that she has diabetes or hypertension. That's a huge step backward for our societies, ourselves, and especially for the role of elders in our societies.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what you're saying, Meredith, with this pandemic, with the influence of the media, there have been significant ways that elders are portrayed, how they're seen, how they're treated, and that affects, it sounds like, the very work that we have to do as gerontologists. Can you say more about that?
Yes, exactly. I think many of us were drawn to gerontology in part because of our concern that elders have long been devalued and treated as different and less worthy in our Western societies. But the pandemic, particularly as it's covered by the media, has magnified this devaluation many times over. Before COVID, for example, we were making real headway, both in academia and in the media, in laying to rest the so-called successful aging narrative, which, in the immortal words of co-founder Jack Rowe, explains why one 80-year-old ends up on skis and another in a wheelchair. Well, your books on the baby boomers, Naomi, beautifully demonstrate how the sheer numbers, vibrancy, and diversity of elders, and for the boomers, often a lifetime of advocacy, make us so much more than the condition of our physical bodies, despite continued anti-aging standards of health and beauty fueling million-dollar industries. But with the pandemic, we're also seeing a lumping together and defining of elders as a big part of the problem, especially if we have those dreaded underlying conditions. Now, without question, elders in nursing homes or assisted living have, as we all know, a far higher death rate from COVID. In the United States, they account of a third of all deaths. And that's a heartbreaking problem for our society as a whole. Never getting to say goodbye to those you love, never getting to hold a hand and help them through this transition. But there's a real catch-22 here, because our decision makers, including in my hyper-liberal state of California, are making COVID-related budget cuts that are heavily skewed toward programs for the elderly, deeply slashing and in some cases trying to do away with in-home supportive services, resource centers for independent living, the programs that enable elders and people with disabilities to live on their own in their own homes and out of nursing homes in the first place. Before the pandemic, the media would often call out such overt ageism and ableism for what it is, both in editorials and in their coverage of intergenerational demonstrations by people fighting such budget cuts. But during COVID, it's almost entirely been coalitions of elders and people with disabilities that have been advocating online against these types of cuts, and they've gotten little or no media attention. In fact, there was one important exception last week. A leader of the disability movement was on NPR, but his main message was that this is the first time in 30 years since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act that not a single person with a disability was at the policy-making table. And you know the old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I do think gerontologists have an important role to play, first in helping ensure that elders are present in making the decisions, and for ourselves being present, sharing the evidence base, doing the media, policy advocacy, and the public education needed to fight such attitudes and policy proposals wherever and whenever they appear, not only for the health and safety of our elders, but also on deeply ethical and moral grounds.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. You know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that said, from our conversations, it struck me that your values, your ethics, they have a substantial impact on the work that you do. And in our conversation, we've talked a lot about critical gerontology, and I really want to pull out for you, what is the critical in critical gerontology?
Thank you for that question. And since my earliest days in gerontology about 40 years ago, the critical perspective has resonated very deeply, embodying as it does a deep commitment to the primary task of the critic, which, as Richard Bernstein pointed out 25 years ago, is to analyze the present and reveal its fractures and instabilities and the ways in which it at once limits us and points to the transgressions of those limits. I think that just says it beautifully. But until I began identifying as an elder, I was primarily walking the political economy path in critical gerontology, learning from the masters like Chris Phillipson and Carol Estes, and studying how political, economic, and social factors interact to help shape and determine the health and life chances of people as they age in society. I remain committed to this work, but as an older gerontologist, I branched out to embrace other paths, including the humanities, that have helped me better focus on moral and ethical issues and on what it feels like to be an older person who's far less visible, and with my rights concerning my own future seeming as though they're slipping away. I want to share with you a very personal example that I've never spoken of publicly before. Both sides of my family, going back 3 generations, have dementia, primarily Alzheimer's disease, to such an extent that a major medical center began the Minkler family study 2 decades ago, of which I'm now a part. As a young woman in my 20s and 30s, I spent a good part of every weekend visiting my grandmother and aunt, both of whom had moderate and then late stage Alzheimer's, and both of whom, along with their sister, who also had this disease, spent well over a decade in nursing homes, eventually dying completely unable to communicate and each weighing about 60 pounds. Well, in my 40s through 60s, I was again spending even more of my time in nursing homes, this time with my mother and both of my paternal uncles, all with dementia, all living well past the time they had wanted to with this disease. My favorite uncle, a nationally known physician, was particularly adamant, and he used to plead with me and other family members with his few remaining words, "Let me go, please let me go." But a combination of medical ethics and no realistic option for people with dementia to make life-ending decisions precluded this from happening. Now, as part of the Minkler family study myself, I learned that I too have the E4 variant of the ApoE gene most closely linked to Alzheimer's. And both yearly neurological exams, MRIs, and my husband and my own observations suggest that I have a good chance of going the way of my mother, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and a younger cousin who recently died of the disease. I've been told my odds of progressing from a very mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's disease within 5 years are about 30%. So if you do want to invite me to a BSG meeting in the future, please take that timetable into account. But seriously, as a gerontologist and a public health scholar, my perspective indeed has changed with age. I read and I fully appreciate and largely agree with Richard Cheston and Gary Christopher's excellent book, Confronting the Existential Threat of Dementia. But as someone whose past, present, and likely future are so deeply connected to this condition, I'm using the humanities path to both read and write about the existential threat in much more personal ways. And as an older advocate, I've been working hard with the national organization Compassion and Choices, which not only helped get end-of-life options legislation enacted in 10 states, but which also developed a dementia provision with people like me in mind. Now, the dementia provision basically allows people like me to lay out the benchmarks beyond which we don't want to travel and which we hope to have honored when the time comes. It has no legal standing, probably never will, but these benchmarks are important to people like me, and mine include no longer recognizing my family, no longer wanting food or drink. Well, the irony in all this is that I had just filled out the dementia provision and added it to my advanced medical care directive and made copies when the pandemic hit. And I realized with real clarity that should I fall prey to the virus, that provision firmly affixed to my advanced directive would mean that I would very likely not get selected for a too scarce ventilator or other life-saving equipment if I needed it. And for that reason, I never did give a copy to my doctor or anyone else, because like all of you, I hope to outlive the virus and then to be able to move forward by sharing my wishes, making them known.
Well, you've just really demonstrated, to go back to the very beginning of this interview, in what ways the personal is political to you, and eloquently, very eloquently, Meredith. Thank you. May I ask one final question? So how would you frame your core interest at this time?
Okay.
As
Well,
an
I
elder
do.
and as a
Yeah.
scholar, and as a critical psychologist.
Yeah. Uh, I thank you, first of all, for letting me end on a positive note. I am clearly committed to continuing the work of compassion and choices, particularly around the dementia provision. But my greatest passion right now is research and advocacy that takes advantage of the window of opportunity that the pandemic provides to press for bold policy changes that can help elders and their families and communities well beyond the time of COVID. For example, America is the incarceration capital of the world. We have 2.1 million people behind bars, and the fastest growing group in that population are older people. I've been helping with the research and advocacy of groups like Human Impact Partners, and they are working very successfully at getting the data that supports the release of elderly inmates and low-level offenders, because these institutions are now the major hotspots for COVID-19 in our country, well outpassing nursing homes. We're also going to be collecting outcome data, both quantitative and qualitative, with the latter including powerful statements from conservative sheriffs and prosecutors who were at first adamantly opposed to decarceration and now realize that locking people up and especially having them live into old age in these institutions is not only bad public health, but morally and ethically just wrong, especially when we can show no adverse consequences of their release. We're also using the COVID moment to advocate far more strongly using participatory action research for housing the homeless. And as you mentioned, increasing food security for elders and their families. And of course, catching up with the UK and every other post-industrialized country and making healthcare a right, not a privilege. And finally, as a nation, we're working hard, as you all know, and much more seriously to end the systemic racism that underlies so much of the pain and suffering in our country, including the fact that nursing homes with resident populations that are at least 25% Black and Latino have COVID death rates twice that of institutions that are primarily white. Now, I said that I wanted to end on a positive note, and that last bit didn't sound too positive, but change is clearly happening in both our countries, and both as gerontologists and human beings, we can use this COVID window of opportunity to broaden the limits of the possible and help promote real and sustainable change that often has proved elusive in better times.
Wow. Thank you so much, Meredith. Thank you. This has been really a wonderful interview, and I'm honored to be the person who was able to interview you. And yes, thank you much for your time, all your work, your energy. I found it really inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Haley. I can't see you, but I really appreciate your taking the interview for us. Take care.
Take care.